Every outlaw has a point of no return. For Billy the Kid, it wasn't a gunfight. It was a road, a long, empty stretch of dust and regret that ran east from Arizona territory, carrying him back into New Mexico and into legend. He'd left the territory once before, a boy with quick hands and bad luck, wanted for a petty theft that turned into a death sentence. In Silver City, he'd been just Henry McCarty or Kid Antrim to the few who bothered to remember him. He'd robbed a Chinese laundry for a handful of clothes, got caught, and slipped a jail window like a ghost. That escape marked his first true crime and his first taste of freedom earned through desperation. Arizona was supposed to be a clean state. It wasn't. In Camp Grant, he found work breaking horses and playing cards, a drifter trying to stay ahead of his past. But Billy had a temper that burned fast and short. In August of 1877, a blacksmith named Frank Windy Cahill picked the wrong day to push the wrong kid. Words turned to fists, fists turned to blood, and before the dust settled, Windy Cahill lay dying on the saloon floor. Billy claimed self-defense. The law called it murder. They threw him in the guardhouse, and before the sentence could come down, he was gone again, slipping into the desert like smoke on the wind. He fled east through Apache country, alone, starving, his horse stolen and his body failing. Days later, a rancher named Haskell Jones found him half dead in the Pecos Valley. The Jones family nursed the kid back from the edge, gave him food, shelter, and a second chance at life. But the frontier had no mercy for second chances. When he rode again, he didn't ride toward reputation. He rode toward company, toward men who spoke his language, outlaws, rustlers, and restless souls chasing fortune one stolen steer at a time. They called themselves the Boys, a gang led by Jesse Evans, a thief with charm and cruelty in equal measure. Billy fell in with them, and together they rode the Pecos trails, lifting cattle, drinking, gambling, and drifting through the shadows of the law. By late 1877, the gang's trail led north into Lincoln County, a place where the rich ruled like kings and the law was just another hired gun. Billy rode into town as the Kid, another saddle in Jesse Evans' crew, not yet famous, not yet feared, just another drifter in a land that turned boys into bullets. He couldn't have known it then, but the road that brought him into Lincoln would never let him leave. The docket before the court tonight, the return of the Kid, the outlaws' road back to New Mexico, and the first step toward the war that would make his name immortal. Court is now in session. Hey, Angela, how's it going tonight?
John, it's good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. We got new toys to play with here in the studio, and so...
You play with the toys.
Yes, see if we can get our audio quality a little bit better, and I don't know, I can do all kinds of cool shit with this, so I'm excited, but it's pretty steep learning curve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why you play with the toys and I don't.
This is probably true.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, you ready for this new episode? We're finally through introducing a whole bunch of freaking people and on to just telling the story now. So it's kind of exciting. So welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue, Gallows, and Gunfights, the courtroom of the Old West, where every outlaw, lawman, and legend takes the stand under oath.
If you've been riding with us this far, you've seen the lines between right and wrong blur until they're nothing but dust in the horizon. And tonight, we follow that dust trail east as Billy the Kid rides out of Arizona back into New Mexico and straight into the storm that would make him a legend.
He's no hero yet, no myth, no ghost of the frontier. He's just the Kid, half outlaw, half survivor, riding into Lincoln County with Jesse Evans' gang at his side and no idea what kind of empire he's about to walk into.
It's that turning point every outlaw faces, when the choices stop being about right or wrong and start being about who lives long enough to tell the story.
And before we unseal the next case file, Do us a favor. If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, hit that follow button and give us a thumbs up.
Leave a review, share the show with someone who loves the real stories of the Old West, not the Hollywood ones, and help keep these trails of history alive.
Your support keeps the lights burning in this courtroom of the past and lets us keep putting the legends of the West on the witness stand.
Court's in session again, and the kid's just ridden into Lincoln.
Before Billy the Kid ever took up a gun in the name of justice, he took a horse that wasn't his. Late 1877, Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory. The name on the arrest sheet wasn't Billy the Kid yet. It was William H. Bonney, or sometimes Henry McCarty, depending on who was asking and who he was running from. He'd been working for Sheriff William Brady, earning his keep mending fences and wrangling cattle. But the sheriff's pay never stretched far enough for a drifter with restless hands and a gambler's streak. So, like so many young men on the frontier, Billy supplemented his wages with side work. Work that didn't come with a ledger or a signature. Wrestling livestock, trading horses, cutting corners where the law looked the other way. One of those horses carried the brand of John Henry Tunstall, the English rancher and merchant with new money and old enemies. Tunstall was trying to break the monopoly of Murphy and Dolan, the house, and that made his stock as valuable as it was dangerous to touch. Billy either didn't know or didn't care. It was Richard Dick Brewer, Tunstall's foreman, who found him. Brewer was a quiet man, capable, loyal, and not yet the captain of the regulators he'd one day become. He spotted Billy with one of Tunstall's stolen horses and did what duty required. He made the arrest himself. For the first time, the kid stood on the wrong side of the bars in the Lincoln County Jail, a small adobe building with more rats than guards and no comfort beyond a patch of shade from the noon sun. The charge was theft, a hanging offense if the court felt inclined to make an example of him. But Lincoln was a land where justice depended on who signed the order and who paid the fee. And for all the law written on paper, the real law was still written on dust, blood, and cattle brands. Billy's arrest was brief, but its consequences lasted forever. Behind those bars, he got his first close look at the powers that ruled Lincoln County. The corrupt sheriff who paid his wages, the foreign rancher whose horses he'd stolen, and the foreman who would soon let him into the war that would make him famous. The verdict of time? The stolen horse didn't just mark Billy's first crime in Lincoln. It marked his first collusion with the men who would shape his destiny. Brady, Tunstall, Brewer. 3 names that would soon carve the line between lawman, outlaw, and martyr, and leave the kid standing somewhere in between. The boy sat in a Lincoln County jail cell, staring at a future that looked a lot like the past. Short, cold, and going nowhere. Outside, the sun baked the street, and the law went about its business, counting cattle, writing warrants, selling justice one favor at a time. Then the door opened, and the man who stepped inside was not the sheriff. He wasn't the prosecutor, and he wasn't there to hang him. It was John Henry Tunstall, the English rancher whose horse the kid had stolen. Tunstall had every right to press charges. He could have made an example of the thief, let the law do its work and prove that his brand carried the same weight as Murphy and Dolan's. But that wasn't the man that Tunstall was. He'd come west chasing something nobler than profit, an idea of fairness in a place that had forgotten what the word meant. And what he saw in that cell wasn't a hardened outlaw. It was a wiry, sunburned teenager with bright eyes and a mind quicker than his hands. Witnesses say Tunstall was surprised, maybe even disarmed, by how polite the prisoner was. Billy spoke well, he read well, and met his gaze without fear. Some said Tunstall even smiled when the kid cracked a joke about the irony of stealing from the only honest rancher in Lincoln County. Whatever the reason, mercy won out over vengeance. Tunstall dropped the charges. Instead of letting the law chew the boy up and spit him out, he offered him a job a legitimate one. Cowboy, cattle guard, ranch hand, work that paid in dollars instead of debt. For the first time in a long while, someone treated Billy McCarty like a man, not a mistake, and that was all it took. He rode out to the Tunstall Ranch, a place that promised something close to decency. There, under the open sky, he worked alongside men who would one day become legends themselves. Dick Brewer, Charlie Bowdry, and Doc Scurlock. The kid found something rarer than freedom. He found respect. It was a small decision, one man's choice to forgive instead of punish, but it changed everything. Tunstall's mercy gave the outlaw a home, a name, and a cause, and in return it gave history the bond that would light the fuse for the Lincoln County War. The verdict of time? When John Tunstall opened that cell door, he wasn't just freeing a prisoner. He was recruiting a soldier, and Billy the Kid would repay that act of mercy with loyalty that lasted beyond life, beyond legend, and beyond the grave. When John Tunstall hired Billy the Kid in late 1877, it marked a turning point, maybe the first real one in the young drifter's short, uncertain life. Tunstall's ranch stood as one of the few outposts in Lincoln County, not under the shadow of the house. Murphy and Dolan's monopoly that controlled land, law, and livelihood. The Englishman's spread ran with structure, fairness, and a code that valued loyalty over lineage. To the men working those fields, it wasn't just a ranch. It was a refuge. Tunstall didn't just give Billy work. He gave him something rarer, trust. He outfitted him with a horse, a saddle, and a brand new Winchester 73 rifle. On the frontier, those weren't gifts. They were declarations. For a teenager with no family and few allies, they were the first real sign that someone saw more in him than just trouble. Billy worked as a cowboy and a cattle guard, protecting Tunstall's herds from the rustlers and the rival factions who prowled the hills. Every day was long and uncertain, riding fence lines, moving stock, keeping watch for thieves or deputies who served Murphy and Dolan's interest instead of the law. Out here, justice came on horseback, and it wore whichever badge had been bought that week. But on Tunstall's ranch, Billy found something that resembled home. The crew around him, men like Charlie Bowdry and Richard Dick Brewer, became more than co-workers. They became a kind of family, bound by the decency of the man who led them and united by their quiet defiance of the house. Tunstall treated Billy with respect and dignity, two currencies that carried more value than gold in Lincoln County. Billy would later say that Tunstall was the only man who ever treated him, quote, like I was a free-born and white, end quote. Crude words from the time, but they revealed a deeper truth. The kid's loneliness, the prejudice he'd endured, and how profoundly that simple respect cut through years of being dismissed as a nobody. In those months, Billy began calling himself William H. Bonney full-time, shedding the names Henry McCarty and Kid Antrim like worn-out skins. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was reinventing. Working for Tunstall gave him what the frontier had always denied him: belonging, purpose, and a cause that felt worth defending. There were no gunfights yet, no ambushes, no headlines, just a fragile peace stretched thin between rival empires, Murphy and Dolan's house on one side and Tunstall's defiant idealism on the other. But anyone with sense could feel it in the air. The storm was coming, and when it broke, the boy from nowhere, the ranch hand with the Winchester rifle, would be right in the middle of it. The verdict of time? Before the legend, before the blood, there was a ranch in Lincoln County where a young outlaw found his purpose. And in the months before the war, Billy Bonney learned the one lesson he'd carry to his grave. Loyalty isn't bought, it's earned. When Billy the Kid worked the Tunstall Ranch near the Rio Felix through the winter of 1877 into the early months of 1878, the ground beneath Lincoln County began to shake, quietly at first, then harder with every passing week. On paper, it was a legal dispute. In truth, it was the opening act of a war. The spark came from the estate of Emil Fritz, the dead partner of the house, the Murphy-Dolan empire that had run Lincoln County like a private kingdom. Alexander McSween, John Tunstall's ally and attorney, had been named executor of Fritz's sizable insurance policy. When McSween refused to hand the funds over to Murphy and Dolan, James Dolan went to court and won a writ that would change everything. Sheriff William Brady, loyal to the house, was ordered to collect the so-called debt. The writ gave him the authority to seize over $40,000 in livestock and assets, Tunstall's cattle, horses, wagons, even supplies. It was a weapon disguised as law. Out on the ranch, the men could feel it in the air. Every rider on the horizon might have been one of Brady's deputies or one of the hired guns who wore the badge by day and the house's colors by night. Billy Bonney was there through it all. He might not have been in the courthouse, but he didn't have to be. He could see the anxiety on every face, hear the whispers around the fire when someone spotted dust on the horizon. The Tunstall outfit stayed armed, alert, and ready. Letters and supplies from town came late or not at all. What had been long days of ranch work turned into nights of sleepless watch. Tunstall refused to surrender. If Sheriff Brady wanted his stock, he'd have to find it first. The Englishman began moving his most valuable herds to safer ground, and for one critical job, he turned to the kid. Billy was ordered to relocate 9 prime horses, slipping them past deputies and rustlers who prowled the open range looking for easy seizures. It wasn't a gunfight, but it was a mission of trust and danger. For Billy, it meant something. A man like Tunstall wouldn't hand a teenager a Winchester, a good horse, and that kind of responsibility unless he believed in him. At the ranch, Dick Brewer, Charlie Bowdry, and the others tightened their circle around Tunstall. They saw what the house was doing, using the sheriff's badge as a brand of intimidation. And they were done hiding from it. What started as legal paperwork had turned into armed standoffs waiting to happen. Billy the Kid was watching it all, taking mental notes the way some men keep prayer books. He was learning how power worked in Lincoln County, that the law was just another gun if you could afford the ammunition. And in those tense, sleepless weeks before the first bullet was fired, the kid's loyalty hardened into something like faith. The verdict of time? Before the shooting began, the war was already being fought. In courtrooms, ledgers, and livestock pens. Billy Bonney rode through it all, discovering that justice in Lincoln County didn't come from judges or juries. It came from whichever side had the courage to stand its ground. February 18th, 1878, the day the Lincoln County War began. Not with a battle, but with a betrayal dressed up as the law. That morning, John Tunstall rode out from his ranch near the Rio Felix, leading a small party of men. With him were Billy the Kid, Richard Dick Brewer, Robert Windeman, John Middleton, and Henry Brown, 5 riders protecting 9 horses bound for Lincoln. The order was clear: move the stock, keep it safe, and stay ahead of the house. Tunstall's cattle and horses had become targets in a so-called debt seizure, a legal writ signed by Sheriff William Brady, who served Murphy and Dolan's interests like scripture. For Brady's posse, this wasn't law enforcement. It was collection work. As the party rode north, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon. Brady's posse, Jesse Evans, William Morton, Tom Hill, and several others, was closing fast. Every man in that group carried a badge, a rifle, and a reputation for working both sides of the law. When the two groups caught sight of one another, Tunstall's men reacted the only way they could. Billy, Brewer, and the others spurred their horses and scattered, seeking cover in the rolling terrain. Hearts pounding, rain snapping through the cold February air, Billy took refuge in the brush, watching from a distance as the sheriff's posse rode down on his employer. John Tunstall stayed behind. He wasn't armed for a fight. He tried to reason with them, raised his hands, spoke calmly. He believed the law could still be reasoned with. He was wrong. Witnesses later say he lifted his arms to show that he carried no weapon. Moments later, Jesse Evans, William Morton, and Tom Hill closed in. Tunstall was shot through the head at close range. When his body hit the ground, his horse went down beside him, both left in the dust as proof that the job was done. From their hiding places, Billy the Kid and the others saw the aftermath, the lifeless shape of the man who had treated them with fairness and dignity, the man who had given them purpose, and the lawman who had rode away without consequence. They rode back to the ranch in shock. By nightfall, word of the killing had reached Lincoln. It was no longer about cattle or debt or rival stores. It was about justice, by badge or by bullet. That gunfire on the open range didn't just end a man's life. It ended the peace of a county. In the days that followed, Billy Bonney and the others who worked for Tunstall, Brewer, Bowdry, Scurlock, Middleton, they all swore an oath. They would form a new posse, one bound not by pay, but by loyalty. They called themselves the Regulators. The verdict of time? The killing of John Tunstall was murder carried out under color of law. It turned ranch hands into gunmen, friends into avengers, and Billy the Kid from a drifting cowboy into a name history would never forget. So not quite the way it went down in Young Guns.
Not quite.
Not quite. I mean, as cold-blooded, for sure, as it was portrayed, but a little bit different story.
Tiny.
So the killing of John Henry Tunstall wasn't quick and it wasn't clean. He was struck first in the chest, knocking him from his horse, and then finished with a bullet to the back of his head. The men who did it, Jesse Evans, William Morton, and Tom Hill, wore badges that day, but not honor. They staged the scene to look like a fight. Tunstall's hat and coat were arranged nearby, his position twisted to suggest that he'd resisted arrest. But everyone who saw it later, Billy, Dick, John Middleton, Henry Brown, Robert Windeman, Fred Waite, they all swore to the same truth. Tunstall was unarmed, and he never drew a weapon. The gunfire scattered his men across the hills, but not far enough to miss what came next. From their hiding places, they watched their employer fall, watched the law ride away like thieves in daylight. When the sound of hooves faded, they returned to the body. The air was heavy, silent except for the restless shuffle of the dead man's horse. They lifted Tunstall's body onto the back of a burro and began the long 20-mile ride back towards Lincoln. They buried him at the ranch under a clear sky that did nothing to soften the anger in their hearts. For Billy, the loss was personal. He later said that Tunstall was the only man who had ever treated him with dignity. That respect had been rare in Lincoln County, and its loss hit harder than any bullet. At the graveside, Billy Bonney swore revenge. Those who were there said that he spoke the words out loud, over the fresh earth, his voice steady and cold. In that moment, the war stopped being about cattle and contracts, and it became personal. By dawn, Dick Brewer and Billy the Kid were in Lincoln, standing before Justice of the Peace John B. Wilson, one of the few officials not owned by the House. They gave sworn affidavits describing the murder and naming the killers, Sheriff William Brady, Jesse Evans, William Morton, and Tom Hill. Wilson agreed, and he signed murder warrants, turning the machinery of law against the men who perverted it. Then he made a decision that would change the face of Lincoln County. He deputized Tunstall's own men. Dick Brewer became special constable, and Billy, along with Fred Waite, John Middleton, and the others, were sworn in as special deputies, charged with arresting Tunstall's killers. It was the birth of a new force in Lincoln. The newspapers would later call them outlaws. They called themselves something else, the Regulators. Within 48 hours, cowboys had become lawmen, and in Lincoln County, the line between justice and vengeance vanished entirely. The verdict of time? Tunstall's murder turned grief into purpose and the law into a weapon of defiance. Billy Bonney, once a drifting hand, now carried both a badge and a rifle, and for the first time, he pointed both in the same direction. The regulators were born not out of rebellion, but out of betrayal, and the war that followed would make their names immortal. 2 days after John Tunstall's murder, the fragile balance of law in Lincoln County finally broke. What had started as legal procedure now twisted into open defiance. Each side carried its own warrants, its own vision of justice, and both were willing to kill for it. On February 20th, 1878, Billy the Kid rode into the town of Lincoln with a lawful purpose. Under his new authority as a deputy constable for Justice of the Peace John V. Wilson, he was there to serve murder warrants against Sheriff William Brady, Jesse Evans, and the others accused of killing Tunstall. With him rode Fred Waite and Constable Martinez, 3 men armed not just with rifles, but with the law itself. They found Brady and his allies gathered at Dolan's store, the very heart of the house's empire. Billy stepped forward, warrant in hand, doing what lawmen were supposed to do. But in Lincoln County, the law belonged to whoever had the most guns behind it. Brady refused the papers outright. He rejected Wilson's authority, sneered at the warrants, and decided to show the kid what real power looked like. The sheriff turned the tables, arresting Billy the Kid, Fred Waite, and Constable Martinez on the spot. They confiscated every weapon they carried, including that Winchester 73 rifle that Tunstall had given Billy only weeks before. To the kid, the gun wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol of trust. Losing it was like losing Tunstall all over again. Martinez was released almost immediately, a token gesture to keep up appearances. But Billy and Waite weren't so lucky. They were thrown into jail, left to stew in the dark. Billy's captivity didn't last. Deputy U.S. Marshal Robert Windeman, a friend and ally of the anti-House faction, arrived in Lincoln with military backing. Backed by a detachment of soldiers, Windeman confronted Brady's men, arrested the jail guards, and set the prisoners free. The regulators rode out again, unbroken and angrier than ever. In that moment, the fight for justice stopped pretending to be legal. 2 governments now existed in Lincoln County, one run by the House and the other by the men who refused to bow to it, and both claimed the same badge. The verdict of time? By arresting Billy Bonney and then losing him to his allies, Sheriff Brady proved what everyone already knew. Lincoln County had no law left to enforce. When the jail doors opened, the regulators didn't just walk free. They crossed the line from lawful deputies to soldiers in a private war. The ink on the regulators' badges was barely dry before the territory stepped in to erase them. News of Tunstall's murder, the regulators' formation, and the murder warrants against Sheriff William Brady spread fast. Too fast for Santa Fe to ignore. What began as a county dispute now looked like rebellion. In February of 1878, New Mexico Territorial Governor Samuel Beach Axtell decided to act. To outsiders, it was about restoring order, but anyone in Lincoln County could see the truth. Axtell's hand rested squarely on the side of the House. Murphy and Dolan weren't just merchants. They were political power. They supplied the forts, fed the soldiers, and lined the pockets of men in Santa Fe. When Axtell heard that a small-town justice and a band of ranch hands had taken upon themselves to challenge that machine, he didn't see justice. He saw insubordination. Axtell moved quickly. He revoked the commission of Justice of the Peace John B. Wilson, the very man who had deputized Dick Brewer, Billy the Kid, and the rest of Tunstall's men, and with a single stroke of the pen, every warrant that Wilson had issued, every badge that he'd handed out, vanished into smoke. Overnight, the regulators went from lawful officers to outlaws. Their badges meant nothing. Their authority was gone. What had been a mission for justice was now branded vigilantism. Governor Axtell's decision didn't stop the violence, it gave it new fuel. From that day forward, every bullet fired by the regulators could be labeled a crime, and every man they hunted could claim self-defense. The deck was stacked, the law reloaded, and Lincoln County was set to burn. The verdict of time? When Governor Axtell stripped the regulators of their authority, he didn't bring peace to the territory, he guaranteed war. By choosing power over principle, he turned justice into treason and made fugitives of the very men who had once worn the badge. By early March of 1878, the Lincoln County War had no more illusions of peace left to lose. The regulators were stripped of their badges, branded outlaws by the governor himself, yet still determined to carry out the justice that the law refused to deliver. On March 6, 1878, the posse led by Dick Brewer rode south into the rugged country near the Rio Penasco. With him were Billy the Kid, Fred Waite, and several others, men who had once been ranch hands, now wearing the weight of deputies turned renegades. Their quarry? William Buck Morton and Frank Baker, both named in affidavits as participants in the killing of John Tunstall. For weeks, the two fugitives had eluded capture, moving through the arroyos in the ranch land under the protection of allies loyal to the house. But the regulators had something more powerful than protection. They had purpose. When Brewer's men finally caught sight of Morton and Baker near the Penasco, there was no dramatic gunfight, no last stand. Outnumbered, tired, and facing men who had sworn vengeance, the fugitives did something few expected. They surrendered. Morton, perhaps sensing a glimmer of hope, agreed to lay down his arms on one condition: that he and Baker be returned alive to Lincoln, to stand before a judge instead of a firing line. Brewer and the regulators, still clinging to the last fragments of legality that they once held, gave their word. They swore that both men would see a fair trial. With their prisoners secured, the regulators began the long ride back north. It was more than a routine escort. It was a statement. For the first time since Tunstall's death, his killers were in custody, and the men who had buried him now held his justice in their hands. But on those lonely trails between the Penasco and Lincoln, the air grew heavier by the mile. No one spoke much. Every man knew the score. There were no courts left to trust, no law left to appeal to, and too many guns waiting on both sides of the horizon. The verdict of time? On the road from the Rio Penasco, the regulators carried two prisoners and the last remnants of their promise to the law. But out here, promises had a short life, and by the time they reached Lincoln, two more men would be dead, and the line between justice and vengeance would be gone for good. For 4 long days after the capture on the Rio Penasco, the regulators rode north, 6 men escorting 2 prisoners across some of the loneliest land in New Mexico territory. The sun burned all day, the wind cut by night, and no one spoke more than they had to. Their prisoners, William Buck Morton and Frank Baker, 2 of the men accused of killing Tunstall. Their captors, Dick Brewer, Billy the Kid, Fred Waite, Charlie Bowdry, John Middleton, and a handful of others. Every man in the saddle knew why they were really there. They called it an arrest, but under the dust and the silence, it felt more like a funeral procession waiting for the service to begin. Morton had surrendered only after Brewer swore on his word that they'd be taken alive to Lincoln, but promises weighed light in Lincoln County. According to later recollections, Morton told more than one traveler along the trail that he doubted he'd ever see town again. He even managed to send out a letter, written under guard, claiming he and Baker were being treated harshly and that he expected to be killed despite the regulators' oath. No copy of that letter survives, but the story of it does, whispered in courtrooms and campfires for years afterward. Within the group, the tension was thick enough to taste. Men like George Coe later recalled arguments, sharp words traded between Brewer and some of his deputies, maybe even Billy himself, about what to do with the prisoners. Nobody recorded the details, but the silence of those rides says enough. The regulators were torn between justice and revenge, and the line between the two got thinner with every mile. Morton kept talking, kept watching their eyes when they stopped for water. Baker rode quiet beside him, listening. 4 days on the trail, 4 days under armed guard, 4 days of promises no one believed. The longer they rode, the clearer it became that this wasn't a march toward trial. It was a countdown. The verdict of time? On the road between the Penobscot and Lincoln, the war was still pretending to be lawful. But every hoofbeat was erasing that illusion. By the time the sun set on the 4th day, 2 men were still breathing who shouldn't have trusted the law, and a posse sworn to uphold it was about to decide what justice really meant. By the morning of March 9th, 1878, the ride was over. 4 days out of the Rio Penobscot, the regulators reached a narrow stretch of country near Blackwater Creek. The prisoners, William Buck Morton and Frank Baker, were still alive, still under guard, and still clinging to the promise that they'd be taken safely to Lincoln. But in Lincoln County, promises didn't live long, and what happened next depends on who you ask. According to the regulators themselves, Morton and Baker made a break for it, an escaped attempt in rough country, somewhere near the banks of the Blackwater. Dick Brewer, acting as leader, claimed that he and his men opened fire only after the prisoners bolted, leaving them with no choice but to shoot. When the smoke cleared, Morton, Baker, and a regulator named McCloskey were all dead. That's the official story. It appeared in statements, in tavern talk, and in letters sent to justify the killings afterward. But even in 1878, few believed it. The other version, the one whispered in Lincoln streets, told a darker tale. Morton and Baker, they said, never ran. They were executed, shot down in cold blood by men who'd lost faith in law and patience with justice. It was also claimed that McCloskey was colluding with them to escape. Evidence from those who found the bodies spoke louder than any affidavit. Each man had been shot multiple times. The wounds in the back of the head, the kind that don't come from running gunfights. Their corpses lay side by side with McCloskey's nearby. The air around them smelled not of fear, but of revenge. Morton had predicted it. Days earlier, he'd told the riders on the trail, and even written it in a letter, that he'd never reach Lincoln alive, that he didn't trust the regulators' word, and history proved him right. The truth of what happened at Blackwater Creek will never be proven in a courtroom, but even regulator George Coe, years later, admitted that tempers were high, words were sharp, and the balance between justice and vengeance was hanging by a thread. The killing of McCloskey only deepened the mystery. Some claimed that he tried to help the prisoners escape. Others said that he'd been marked as a traitor or simply caught in the crossfire of rage and paranoia that had been building for miles. The verdict of time? Whether it was an escape or an execution, the result was the same. 3 men dead and the last trace of legality gone from the regulators' cause. The Blackwater killings turned a feud into open war. From that moment on, Lincoln County would be ruled not by courts or warrants, but by lead and loyalty. So again, a little bit different than it played out in Young Guns. I think they had to kind of speed things up a little bit, so they just caught them and killed them. But it had to suck for those guys being, riding, knowing that they're not taking you back to Lincoln. How could they possibly take them back to Lincoln where the sheriff was a total pile of shit?
Yeah.
So they knew. It just is surprising it took 4 days for him to do the deed.
Yeah.
The same day bullets found William Buck Morton and Frank Baker on the road to Lincoln, fate dealt its own hand 80 miles southwest near the settlement of Tularosa, where 2 more of John Tunstall's killers would meet their reckoning, not from the regulators' guns, but from the very life they chose to live. Tom Hill, one of the men who had ridden with Jesse Evans and fired the shots that killed Tunstall, was back to what he knew best: robbery. Hill and Evans, still flying the Murphy-Dolan banner, tried to hold up a group of locals near Tularosa, but this time the locals shot back. When the smoke cleared, Tom Hill was dead where he fell. The outlaw who'd once carried out the house's dirty work now lay face down in the dust, his final crime undone by his own arrogance. Jesse Evans, the hard-eyed leader of the gang that bore his name, didn't fare much better. He caught lead during the same gunfight, badly wounded, bleeding, and suddenly mortal in a way that he'd never been before. Lawmen from the area arrested him where he lay. The same man who had terrorized Lincoln County for years now found himself in a jail cell, too weak to run and too wounded to fight. It was a strange symmetry. On March 9th, 1878, while the regulators killed Morton and Baker near Blackwater Creek, the house's hired guns were falling apart in Tularosa. Within a few hours, 3 of the men responsible for Tunstall's murder were dead or captured. The Evans gang, once the muscle behind the house's iron rule, was shattered. Hill was gone, Evans was wounded and under arrest, and the chain of command inside the Murphy-Dolan faction was broken. It didn't bring peace, not by a long shot, but it shifted the balance. The regulators might have lost their badges, but for the first time since the war began, they weren't the only ones bleeding. The verdict of time? The death of Tom Hill and the fall of Jesse Evans didn't end the war. It only changed its temperature. For the first time, the House felt the weight of its own violence, and in Lincoln County, retribution was starting to look a lot like justice. So on the morning of April 1st, 1878, it's amazing just how fast all this shit's happening. It's like boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
So the morning of April 1st, 1878 began like any other in the town of Lincoln, New Mexico, a long strip of dust and adobe where the law was decided by whoever could draw the fastest. But under that quiet, something mean was building. Sheriff William Brady, the man who wore the house's star, walked his usual route down Main Street. With him were deputies George Henman and Billy Matthews, both loyal, both armed, both veterans of too many skirmishes to count. They were out to serve papers, watch for regulators, and remind Lincoln who still held authority. To them, it was another morning of order in a county spinning apart. But across the street, unseen behind Tunstall's old store, 6 men waited. They weren't lawmen anymore, not officially, but they still carried the badges inside them like ghosts. Billy the Kid, Jim French, Frank McNabb, John Middleton, Henry Newton Brown, Fred Waite, the regulators. Tunstall's riders turned avengers, crouched in silence behind adobe walls and rough-cut fences, their rifles leveled at the very man they blamed for their employer's murder. The corral gave them perfect cover. An elevated view of the street, shadows deep enough to hide 6 men and a cause. They had been there since dawn, waiting, breathing the same dry air that always hung before a gunfight. From their positions, they could see every doorway, every hitching post, every step that Brady took. The objective was clear and simple: kill Sheriff Brady. Not out of bloodlust, but out of something colder: retribution. Brady had stood at the center of Tunstall's murder, had arrested Billy and the others under false authority, had mocked every notion of fairness that Lincoln had left. Now the regulators meant to end it. Out on the street, Brady and his men had no reason to expect what waited for them. They moved along the same route as always, past the Murphy and Dolan stores, the courthouse, and down the street lined with merchants who watched from behind their windows, pretending to sweep or tend stock. Lincoln wasn't a town that missed much. Everyone knew something was coming. They just didn't know when. Inside the corral, Billy watched from the shadows, one finger resting on the trigger of a Winchester. He could see Brady's badge flash in the morning sun, a glint that must have looked almost holy to a man about to die. All around him, the others waited, rifles steady, hearts pacing like the ticking of a clock. The street was empty except for the lawmen walking into the center of town. The townsfolk had vanished indoors, drawn by instinct or by fear. Even the horses were restless, shifting against their tethers, hooves scraping nervously against the stone. Lincoln held its breath. The regulators held their fire. And for one suspended moment in time, the war waited, balanced between justice and the pull of a trigger. The quiet along Lincoln's main street was thin as glass, ready to shatter at the touch of a trigger. Behind the adobe wall of Tunstall's corral, the 6 men waited. Each one held his place in the dust and the shadow, rifles resting across the wall's edge, eyes fixed on the figures moving below. Down on the street, Sheriff William Brady and his deputies, Hinman and Matthews and others, walked their usual patrol route, passing in front of Dolan's store. To them, it was just another morning under the same hard sky. They didn't know the men they'd hunted were watching from 20 yards away, waiting for them to step into the open. Then the first shot came. Brady went down first, hit multiple times before he could even draw. He fell hard into the dirt, his badge flashing once in the sunlight before vanishing beneath it. Beside him, Deputy George W. Hinman staggered, hit in the chest and the throat, collapsing only feet away. The air filled with gun smoke and the sharp echo of rifles off adobe walls. The ambush was over in seconds, but the sound hung in Lincoln like thunder that wouldn't fade. Brady and Hinman lay dead in the street, and the rest of the sheriff's men scrambled for cover, firing wildly towards the corral. But the regulators were ghosts behind the wall, unseen, unflinching, and silent once their work was done. It wasn't random. It wasn't rage. It was retribution. Broad daylight vengeance for John Tunstall, the man who had treated Billy Bonney like more than an outlaw. A message written in gunfire declaring that the House no longer owned Lincoln County and that the regulators would answer murder with murder. When the shooting stopped, Lincoln fell silent. Just the hiss of wind through bullet holes and the soft scrape of boots retreating into doorways. Sheriff William Brady and Deputy Hinman lay dead in the dirt, their badges half buried by the same dust they'd ruled over. But the fight wasn't finished. From behind the Tunstall corral, Billy the Kid and Jim French broke cover. It was a desperate sprint into open daylight, 2 men running straight into the same line of fire that they'd just unleashed. They weren't chasing glory. They were after something that mattered far more. Lying beside Brady's body was John Tunstall's Winchester rifle, the weapon Brady had confiscated weeks earlier when he'd arrested Billy and Lincoln. To Billy, that rifle wasn't just a gun. It was a symbol, his connection to the man who had treated him as more than an outlaw. But there was more on Brady's body than steel and walnut stock. The sheriff carried papers, arrest warrants, legal orders, and writs of seizure, documents that named the regulators themselves as fugitives. Billy and French reached the fallen sheriff, grabbing the rifle and trying to snatch the documents from his coat. Before they could make it back to cover, Deputy Billy Matthews took aim from across the street and fired. The bullet tore through the air and grazed both men, slicing through flesh at the thigh and the leg. Billy staggered. French stumbled, but neither fell. They dragged the rifle and papers back behind the corral wall as bullets splintered adobe around them. Their wounds were light, but the meaning of what they'd done was heavy. That morning in Lincoln, they hadn't just killed a sheriff. They'd reclaimed the last pieces of their fallen employer and stripped the house of its law in one stroke. The Winchester was vengeance made tangible. The papers were survival. And together, they told the truth of the war that now owned Lincoln County. There were no lawmen left, only sides. The verdict of time? The ambush on Sheriff William Brady marked the point of no return. By recovering the rifle and the warrants, Billy the Kid and the regulators symbolically took the law into their own hands, literally and permanently. From that day on, They weren't deputies, cowboys, or avengers. They were outlaws, men bound not by oath or badge, but by blood, loyalty, and the memory of John Henry Tunstall. 4 days after the killing of Sheriff Brady, the regulators rode south toward the Sacramento Mountains, following a name that had found its way into their list: Andrew L. Buckshot Roberts. To the regulators, Roberts was another man in the house's pocket, an associate of Jesse Evans, a sometime rancher and trader who had done business with Murphy and Dolan. But Roberts wasn't a lawman, and he wasn't a hired gun. He was a frontier drifter, an ex-Texas Ranger, a man who'd fought Indians, bandits, and worse. His only crime, at least on paper, was bad company. The regulators, at least a dozen strong, found him at Blazer's Mill, a small sawmill and settlement in the Rio Tularosa, owned by Dr. Joseph Blazer. The group included Billy the Kid, Charlie Bowdry, John Middleton, Fred Waite, and their leader, Dick Brewer. They came with rifles ready and justice on their tongues. Brewer called out to Roberts, demanding his surrender. Roberts refused. He had no reason to trust a posse that carried its justice in gun barrels. Instead, he grabbed his Winchester rifle, took cover near the carpenter's shop, and braced himself for the fight that he knew was coming. The gunfight that followed was pure chaos. Close quarters, splintered boards, and powder smoke thick enough to choke a man. Roberts, firing from behind timber piles and door frames, shot Charlie Bowdry through the chest. Bowdry fell, coughing blood, but somehow stayed alive. Moments later, John Middleton caught a round too. Another man down, another shock in a fight that wasn't supposed to be this hard. Roberts fought like he had a whole damn army behind him. Wounded, bleeding, but still steady, he fired with deadly precision. When Dick Brewer tried to flank him, slipping behind a stack of logs to get a clear shot, Roberts saw the movement, turned, and fired one clean round. The bullet hit Brewer square in the eye. He died instantly, falling without a sound. Even as blood pooled around him, Buckshot Roberts refused to quit. He'd taken multiple hits by the time the shooting stopped, but he had killed Brewer, wounded several others, and fought a dozen men to a standstill. By sundown, Roberts was dying. They found him slumped inside one of the mill buildings, his rifle still warm. He died that evening, taking his pride and his pain with him. For the regulators, the battle at Blazer's Mill was an absolute disaster. Their best leader, Dick Brewer, was dead. Their ranks were bloodied, their morale shaken. The gunfight proved that not every enemy would fall easily, and that sometimes vengeance came with a cost that they hadn't counted on. And for Buckshot Roberts, it was a last stand written in fire and grit, a man who hadn't chosen this war but refused to die on anyone's terms but his own. By the time the gunsmoke cleared at Blazer's Mill, the regulators' victory had turned hollow. Dick Brewer, their leader, and the one man who had tried to keep their vengeance tethered to some kind of order, was gone, killed by a man who'd never meant to be their enemy. Andrew L. Buckshot Roberts hadn't ridden in the Lincoln County War to take sides. He wasn't a hired gun, and he wasn't one of the house's assassins. He was a rancher and former Texas Ranger, a man who'd seen too many fights already and was trying to sell his holdings and leave New Mexico behind. But war doesn't ask for consent. The regulators had marked him as a name connected to the house, and that was enough. When they surrounded him at the mill, Roberts did not surrender. He couldn't afford to. He fought not for politics or power, but because he knew what happened to men who trusted armed strangers promising justice. He defended himself the only way that he knew how, with precision, with courage, and with the kind of fatal resolve that came from experience. In the end, he took Dick Brewer's life, wounded Bowdry and Middleton, and held off a dozen armed men until his own body gave out. He died that night, alone but unbeaten. The verdict of time? Buckshot Roberts did not deserve to die. He wasn't a murderer. and he wasn't part of the machine that had killed John Tunstall. He was simply a man caught in the middle of someone else's war, branded an enemy by association. His death at Blazer's Mill showed how far the fight had fallen from its cause, how vengeance had outgrown justice, and how good men could be lost for nothing more than proximity to the wrong name. For the regulators, the price was steep. They lost their leader, their discipline, and a piece of the moral ground they'd once stood on. From that day forward, there was no illusion left. The war wasn't about right and wrong anymore. It was about survival, and the trail ahead would only grow darker. So again, a little bit different than the movie. I don't know why they decided to portray this guy as like a bounty hunter that came in after him, but that was definitely not the case. Cinema. Yeah. But, I mean, what more cinematic of a story do you want than that? They just picked on this poor freaking guy that was trying to sell out and leave, and he kicked the shit out of him?
Yeah.
That's pretty freaking cinematic.
I mean, yeah.
Anyway, when the gunfight...
Like the movie.
They should have got me to rate the damn movie. When the gunfire faded at Blazer's Mill, only two men lay dead, Dick Brewer and Buckshot Roberts, but the echoes of that fight would outlast them both. The regulators stood in shock among the spent shells and the splintered timber. Their leader, the one man who'd kept vengeance from collapsing into chaos, was gone, killed by a man who hadn't even been their enemy in truth. Charlie Bowdry and John Middleton bled from their wounds, leaning against walls still scarred by rifle fire. Fred Waite and the others gathered Brewer's body in silence, too drained for words. They buried him near the mill, on a small knoll overlooking the Rio Tularosa. No ceremony, no gun salute, just a rough wooden cross bearing his name, and a few words whispered by men who had run out of prayers. They didn't dare linger. The war was spreading, and the hunters were already coming. The regulators were wanted now for the deaths of Sheriff Brady, Deputy Hinman, and Buckshot Roberts, and even for the murders that they hadn't yet committed. Brewer's death broke something inside the group. He had been the steady hand, the lawman's conscience inside a band of outlaws. Without him, command splintered. The regulators scattered into smaller units, retreating southwest into the scrublands to avoid the soldiers and the posses riding in their wake. And in that vacuum, one name began to rise above the rest: Billy the Kid. He wasn't the oldest or the wisest, but he was the boldest. Fearless when the others hesitated, reckless when others paused. In the space Brewer left behind, Billy filled the silence with gunfire and defiance. For the people living around Blazer's Mill, the fight left its mark. They had watched the war crawl out of Lincoln and into their valley, and they understood now that it could touch anyone. Buckshot Roberts, a man trying to sell his land and walk away from the feud, had died for nothing more than proximity. To the settlers of the Tularosa, it was proof that this war no longer had sides, just victims. The death of Dick Brewer became a kind of frontier monument, a wooden cross standing for every man who thought justice could survive in a land ruled by gunsmoke. His grave marked the point where vengeance stopped pretending to be righteousness, and where the Lincoln County War became what it had always threatened to be: a blood feud without an exit. After Dick Brewer fell at Blazer's Mill, the regulators were left bleeding, leaderless, and hunted. They had buried their captain on a lonely rise by the river, and with him went the last piece of restraint that they still possessed. Out of that quiet came Frank McNabb, a ranch foreman, lawman, and one of the few older hands left alive from Tunstall's crew. He wasn't loud, he wasn't reckless, not yet, but he carried a calm that men could follow. In a war of hot tempers, McNabb was the first to think before drawing still. Leadership didn't come through ceremony. There were no votes, no speeches, just a slow nod of agreement around the fire. McNabb took command because somebody had to. The regulators were fractured, half wounded, half demoralized, and all wanted men. Someone needed to point them back toward purpose. Under McNabb, they tried to hold to their official mission, find and punish the killers of John Tunstall. But the shape of that mission had changed. The badges were gone. The courts were corrupt, and every move they made now drew the blood of new enemies. What had begun as a search for justice was now a campaign for survival. McNabb rode hard and often, driving the regulators through skirmishes and raids, small battles that didn't even make the papers but left their marks on both sides. He led them at the Fritz Ranch, where ambushes and betrayals became daily hazards, and the line between hunter and hunted vanished. Every ride grew riskier, every return thinner. Frank McNabb's leadership lasted only weeks, but in the short time the war changed again. Brewer had fought to keep their vengeance legal. McNabb fought to keep them alive. And in that shift from order to open vendetta, the Lincoln County War hardened into the conflict history remembers, a storm of retribution with no law left to contain it. The verdict of time? Frank McNabb never sought command, and he never lived long enough to see what his leadership became. He inherited a broken cause and tried to hold it together through duty and instinct. But the war had outgrown discipline. His few weeks at the helm bridged the last breath of purpose and the first full grasp of chaos, a path that would lead straight to his own death and to the final bloody reckoning in Lincoln. After Dick Brewer fell at Blazer's Mill, the regulators buried their first leader and turned again toward war. They chose Frank McNabb to take the reins, quiet, capable, and already proven in Gunsmoke. He'd been a foreman, a lawman, and one of Tunstall's most trusted men. If anyone could steady the band of fugitives still calling themselves deputies, it was Frank. Under McNabb, the regulators tried to remember what the fight was supposed to mean. Justice for John Tunstall, not slaughter for its own sake. But justice in Lincoln County had become a corpse with too many hands on it. Each week brought new raids, ambushes, and retaliations, names scratched from both ledgers before the ink was dry. The Seven Rivers Gang, riding for Murphy and Dolan, prowled the valleys south of town. McNabb led his men into that country, hunting killers who were hunting them. On April 29, 1878, the hunters became the hunted. McNabb, Ab Sanders, and Frank Coe rode near Fritz Ranch, unaware that Manuel Segovia, Bob Beckwith, and Dutch Charlie Kruling waited in ambush. The first volley cut the morning in half. McNabb took a bullet in the chest and dropped from his saddle before he could draw. Saunders was hit next, badly wounded, and Coe was dragged off alive, a prisoner of the very men they'd been tracking. By sundown, word of McNabb's death reached the others. Another captain gone, another grave with no marker. And with each burial, the regulators grew fewer, angrier, and less certain of what they were still fighting for. They gathered in hiding to choose again. This time, the choice fell on Josiah Gordon Doc Scurlock, the educated one, the marksman, the calm voice amid the fever. Scurlock wasn't the loudest gun, but he was the sharpest mind left standing. He took command in the middle of chaos, inheriting a company half broken and fully outlawed. Under Scurlock, the regulators pulled together long enough to survive the coming storm, but they would face the siege of Lincoln, a 5-day inferno that would decide the war's end and write Billy the Kid's legend in gunfire. But in this moment, in the rain at Fritz Ranch, the regulators understood what they'd become. 3 captains dead in less than 2 months, each one more desperate than the last. The verdict of time? Frank McNabb never lived to see the justice he rode for. He died believing the fight still had purpose, though history would prove it had already lost one. His death marked the last flicker of order before the war burned into chaos. And as Doc Scurlock took command, the regulators' cause turned from righteousness to survival, a company of ghosts chasing vengeance through the storm that would soon swallow Lincoln whole. When Frank McNabb fell at Fritz Ranch, the regulators buried their captain under hard soil and harder silence. But grief never lasted long in Lincoln County. It turned too quickly to vengeance. There was one name on every man's lips that week: Manuel Segovia. Segovia was a Seven Rivers warrior, a cowboy and gun hand riding for the house, and the man most believed had fired the shot that killed McNabb. He hadn't hidden. He'd gone home to Seven Rivers, the outlaw settlement where Dolan's allies gathered like wolves around a carcass. For the regulators, that made him both target and message. On May 15, 1878, the regulators rode out. No courtroom, no warrant, just a handful of men with guns and the memory of their dead captain. They found Segovia near the settlement. Accounts differ. Some said he tried to run, others that he never got the chance. Either way, the rifles spoke, and Manuel Segovia fell. The official story claimed that he tried to escape, but Lincoln County was done with official stories. Everyone knew what it was: a killing for a killing, a frontier execution thinly dressed as justice, and with that single volley, the blood debt deepened. In Seven Rivers, the message was received. The warriors and the house riders swore their own oaths. From this point on, nobody expected prisoners. Every man on both sides slept with a gun under his coat and his boots on the floor. The war had stopped pretending it was about law. Now it was about revenge, naked and personal. Somewhere in that smoke and gunpowder haze, a new face appeared among the regulators: Tom O'Phalliard. Younger than most, loyal to a fault, and he'd soon become Billy the Kid's shadow, the man who rode closest when the rest began to fall away. He joined them in the spring of '78, just as Billy's name started to mean a little something more than just trouble. With each funeral and each gunfight, Billy's voice carried a little farther. By summer, he wasn't just a fighter, he was the spark. The verdict of time? The killing of Manuel Segovia didn't end anything. It just carved another notch into the ledger. Each side told itself the other fired first, that justice rode with their gun. But by May of 1878, justice was long dead in Lincoln County. What remained was survival and the countdown to the final siege, where every name left alive would have to stand, shoot, or burn inside the town of Lincoln. By the spring of '78, Lincoln County was bleeding from 100 wounds. The law wore too many faces, and none of them were clean. The regulators, once sworn officers, had become fugitives. The House, once merchants, had turned into warlords. And somewhere between the two rode a 19-year-old kid with a borrowed rifle and a taste of justice gone sour. Billy the Kid had started the year as a ranch hand, underfed, underestimated, still hoping for a life that didn't end with a bullet. But every grave, Tunstall, Brewer, McNabb, carved away another piece of who he'd been. By May, he wasn't just fighting for his boss or his friends. He was fighting because he didn't know how to stop. Seven Rivers ran red, and Lincoln braced for whatever came next. Each dawn brought another rumor: soldiers on the road, Dolan men riding east, McSween stockpiling guns. Every door in town was bolted, every family waiting for the sound that meant it had finally begun. The verdict of time says this: there were no heroes left by the summer of '78, only survivors. The regulators called it justice, the House called it order, but history calls it what it was: revenge set loose on the frontier. And in that chaos, Billy the Kid found the one thing the law could never take from him: his legend. Born in gunfire, tempered in grief, and carried on the wind to every saloon that ever whispered his name. Next time, the waiting ends. Lincoln will burn. The war will break open, and the boy from nowhere will finally step into history. The Lincoln County War had started as a clash of ledgers and contracts. By the spring of 78, it was nothing but dust, blood, and names carved into wood. Billy the Kid was no longer just a hired hand. He became the living symbol of a county tearing itself apart. Every trigger pulled in Lincoln echoed across the territory, and there were plenty more yet to come.
Each step deeper into this war blurred the line between law and outlaw, justice and revenge. For the people living through it, there was no black or white, just survival in a place where the law answered to the highest bidder. And with every grave that filled, the shadow of what was coming grew darker over Lincoln.
Next time on Gallows and Gunfights, we'll step into that storm. 5 days of siege, fire, and betrayal that would leave Lincoln burning and Billy the Kid a legend. It's the battle that ended one war and started another. The moment when everything that could be lost was, and the boy they called Billy became the outlaw the world would never forget.
If you've been riding with us through the dust and the gun smoke, don't forget to follow Dark Dialogue, Gallows, and Gunfights wherever you listen. You can support the show, explore case archives, and join the Dark Dialogue Collective at darkdialogue.com. And if you believe in keeping history's ghosts talking, share the show, leave a review, or support us on Substack or Ko-fi to help keep these stories alive.
From the frontier towns where the law wore a badge by day and a mask by night, this is Dark Dialogue, Gallows and Gunfights, where we let the past take the stand and the guilty face the gallows.